This hearing of the Budget Committee will come to order. I thank our witnesses for being here, one of whom will be introduced by Senator Kaine, who is here to welcome someone to speak about an important issue in his state of Virginia. As we examine the looming economic and budgetary dangers of climate change, today we will learn about the strain it's placing on our defense operations and our national security. Climate change is a well-known catalyst of conflict and also threatens our military's infrastructure and operational readiness, and all of that comes at significant cost. According to a recent Bloomberg analysis, rising tides and powerful storms, turbocharged by climate change, are poised to hobble federal facilities worth at least $387 billion in coming decades, disrupting everything from veterans' medical care to military operations and space exploration. The vast majority of these costs are related directly to military infrastructure. For over a decade, the Government Accountability Office has identified climate change as a high-risk area for the Department of Defense and has highlighted billions of dollars in annual damage to our military installations. For instance, in a congressional hearing this month, the Air Force testified that rebuilding U.S. facilities in Guam damaged by Typhoon Mawar will cost $10 billion alone. That's twice what the Department of Defense spent rebuilding Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases in Florida and Nebraska, both also devastated by climate change-related weather events. Around the world, nearly half of America's military installations are facing threats from rising sea levels and increased flooding, with serious damage becoming increasingly frequent. Naval Station Norfolk, the world's largest naval base, is particularly vulnerable. In Hampton Roads, persistent flooding, even on bright sunny days, disrupts operations and requires extensive and costly adaptation efforts. A former base commander estimated that Norfolk's useful life as a naval base could end in as little as 20 years, and he said that in 2015, so do the math. In Rhode Island, our Air National Guard 143rd Airlift Wing operates out of a high-risk coastal flood area, threatening its ability to deploy to protect life, property, and safety. Much of the neighboring Electric Boat submarine manufacturing facility, producing Columbia-class submarines, the Pentagon's top acquisition priority, also sits in the high-risk coastal flood area, vulnerable to storm surge and extreme weather. Across Narragansett Bay, the United States Naval War College and Naval Station Newport share causeways which I've seen cut off by increasingly heavy rainstorms, New England's climate telltale. In short, repairing, rebuilding, and maintaining our defense infrastructure, the foundation of our national security, is becoming ever more costly in a world shaped by climate upheaval. Climate change is a source of geopolitical tensions, hence its acknowledgement as a catalyst of conflict. Around the world, climate change is destabilizing entire regions, stoking conflicts over increasingly scarce resources, driving impoverishment and migration, and creating new tensions in geopolitically sensitive areas. In the Arctic, melting ice has opened new sea routes, creating new security threats from Russia and China that require increased U.S. military and Coast Guard presence. Far away in low-lying Bangladesh, sea level rise and extreme weather could cause mass migration, perhaps 13 million people, toward and into India. On the other end of India, in Kashmir, tensions between a nuclear-armed India and a nuclear-armed Pakistan will worsen as Himalayan glaciers disappear and disputes intensify over water resources and border management. It is widely accepted that climate-driven drought contributed to the ongoing conflict in Syria, fueling regional political instability. In Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, disrupted agriculture and worsened food and water insecurity has brought climate destabilization to our own borders. In the coming decades, climate change could drive climate migration of up to 200 million people worldwide, all making the world more dangerous. In that more dangerous world, military operations will be made more difficult and dangerous, as soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have to work in unprecedented conditions, often testing the limits of human physical endurance. Already, air operations are affected by midday surface heat on airbase runways. As many national security experts have recognized, climate change is causing environmental damage that affects global stability, our national safety, and our long-term fiscal health. And all that comes home to roost in America's budget. If you don't believe me, just read the Pentagon's and intelligence community's own reports. And on the subject of believing reports, let me close by asking unanimous consent that certain reports be put into the record that confirm concerns that have been raised here in the Budget Committee and earlier hearings with regard to insurance cost inflation and contagion of the insurance crisis beyond Florida, a May 14, 2024 New York Times article. With respect to coastal flooding risk, an April 29, 2024 Washington Post article. With respect to the dangers to agriculture, a March 27, 2024 New York Times article, and with respect to the dangers we have repeatedly raised of systemic economic shocks to the American economy and even to the global economy, the Economist article of April 11, 2024, and the NBER working paper of May 2024, Macroeconomic Impacts of Climate Change, Global versus Local Temperature, which says that a 1 degree centigrade increase in global temperature will lead to a 12% decline in world GDP, and suggests that the harm from carbon emissions amounts to over $1,000 of harm per emitted ton. Without objection, those will be admitted to the record, and I turn now to my distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is our committee's 17th hearing on climate change this Congress, but the first with a national security angle. And everybody knows that national security is the #1 responsibility of the federal government under our Constitution, so it's appropriate that we consider national security. I agree that climate change presents some national security-related challenges, and the chairman laid out a long list of those. However, those challenges pale in comparison to the national security risks associated with our ballooning national debt. As Admiral Michael Mullen, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said in 2010, quote, "The most significant threat to our national security is our debt," end of quote. And that was when public debt was $9 trillion compared to today's $34 trillion. So it's 3 times bigger at this point. Our unsustainable national debt threatens our status as an economic superpower and, in turn, our ability to respond to national threats. We're already set to see interest payments on the national debt surpass defense outlays this year. That's the kind of results you get when spending follows the modern monetary theory approach to spending and government borrowing. Throughout history, fiscal recklessness and economic mismanagement have led to decline of great powers. I left unchecked, excessive red ink will sap away our military superiority and our capacity for global leadership. This would be a tragedy not only for Americans, but for the entire world, from the standpoint of a lot of our friends relying upon us for leadership and for our possible enemies not seeing us as a threat that we hope they would to avoid any conflagration. We've seen from the disastrous results of the Obama administration lead from behind strategy that America's weakness only invites global instability. That doesn't mean that I'm willing to give the Defense Department a blank check. Far from it. If anybody's followed my history in the United States Senate and oversight of wasteful spending in the Pentagon, they would recognize the $450 hammers and the $700 toilet seats. And for years, I pushed DOD to make progress on getting a clean audit, just like every other federal department. And to this very day, the DOD is the only department that has never had a certified audit. Every dollar squandered by the Pentagon is a dollar that's not going towards keeping the country safe. That's something we can't afford at a time of rising threats. Providing for the common defense is one of the federal government's top constitutional responsibilities. So I say that a second time to remind people what we should be doing here in this Congress as our highest priority. As I've said in previous hearings, climate change is a serious issue. And as I referenced earlier, it has some implications for national security and the Pentagon budget. For example, melting sea ice means new shipping lanes and accessible resources in the Arctic. China and Russia are already aggressively staking out their claims in that area. This is a legitimate challenge, and the congressional committees of jurisdiction are giving it due attention. But let's be clear-eyed about our priorities. Climate change is hardly one of the most important challenges that the Defense Department ought to focus its attention on. The Biden administration's obsession with reducing the military's carbon footprint actually distracts from the armed forces' real mission of deterring and defeating our enemies. The administration's rush transition to an electric vehicle fleet appears to be driven more by political posturing rather than military strategy. So you gotta think, good luck finding a charging station in the middle of some foreign battlefield. Similarly, far-left climate policy jeopardizes our economy, our energy security, while undermining our national security. Many European countries learned this lesson the hard way after Russia invaded Ukraine February 22, 2 years ago, and those European countries are reversing course on some of these climate change issues. Now, Europe is working overtime to increase their capacity to import more liquefied natural gas from the United States since they don't get it from Russia anymore. This may be the committee's only hearing on the defense budget this Congress, so I hope we can take off the climate change blinders and discuss some other national security issues. Climate change didn't cause a rising and aggressive China. It didn't convince Putin to invade Ukraine, and it didn't instigate Hamas' brutal terrorist attack on the Israeli people. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses where they think climate change ranks against some other more pressing national security challenges. I welcome all of today's witnesses, and I especially want to thank Admiral McGinn and Admiral Gallaudet and Mr. Dwyer for your services to our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was actually glad that you mentioned Dennis Mullen's statement, because it was one I often referred to as we were working on the Affordable Care Act, because the next step is that healthcare cost was what was driving the debt and deficit that he was worried about, and we were trying to tangle with that. So I appreciate very much the good conversations we've had about working together on the healthcare expense problems that are driving our deficit. I think climate economic shock and revenue reduction, particularly from the corporate sector, which used to do more than 20% of national revenues, is now down to 6% and less, is also an important part of the equation. And with any luck, we can pull a full equation together to solve the problem that you've identified. Now to our witnesses. Admiral Dennis McGinn is a strategic leadership advisor focused on the intersection of energy, environment, and national security. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy Installations and Environment from September 2013 until January 2017, leading the transformation of naval installations toward greater mission resiliency. Admiral McGinn was active duty in the United States Navy for 35 years as a naval aviator, test pilot, and national security strategist. He led the development of future Navy capabilities as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for warfare requirements and commanded the United States Third Fleet in the Pacific. He presently serves as a trustee for RMI, as a director of Willdan Group, and served as a director for the Electric Power Research Institute for more than 6 years. Erin Sikorsky directs the Center for Climate and Security, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institute of the Council on Strategic Risks. Ms. Sikorsky also serves on the Secretary of the Interior's Advisory Council for Climate Adaptation Science, as a consultant for the Defense Science Board, and as an adjunct professor at George Mason University. She previously led climate and environment analysis across the U.S. intelligence community from her position on the National Intelligence Council, where she was the founding chair of the Climate Security Advisory Council, a congressionally mandated group designed to facilitate coordination between the intelligence community and U.S. government scientific agencies. Rick Dwyer is next, and we will trade up for introductions to have him introduced by his home state senator, Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, and to my colleagues and those attending. It is a pleasure to have Rick Dwyer here today. He's the Executive Director of the Hampton Roads Military and Federal Facilities Alliance. That's such a mouthful that we just shorten it and call it HARUMFA, which is one of my favorite acronyms, HARUMFA. HARUMFA is a unique public-private partnership dedicated to supporting the many military and federal facilities in the Hampton Roads region of southeastern Virginia. This is our second largest metropolitan area in Virginia after the D.C. metro area. The alliance is governed by a board of directors that is comprised of 16 public sector directors and 14 private sector directors. And just to give you an idea of the span that HARUMFA reaches, representatives are from the cities of Chesapeake, Franklin, Hampton, Newport News, Norfolk, Poquoson, Portsmouth, Suffolk, Virginia Beach, and Williamsburg, and the counties of Gloucester, Isle of Wight, James City, Southampton, Surrey, and York. Before joining the Alliance in 2016, Rick served over 20 years on active duty as an Air Force civil engineer officer. He commanded 3 civil engineer squadrons, deployed multiple times to Afghanistan and Southwest Asia. And I've had the pleasure of working with the Alliance since I came to the Senate, and with Rick directly for many years, where we worked together to support the Hampton Roads area across many policy areas, including the NDAA, support for shipyards, national labs, military families, mental health of service members. Rick took over as the executive director of HARUMFA from Rear Admiral Craig Quigley, who many of you know. And those are big shoes to fill, but Rick has done a really good job in this very important but very complicated region in dealing with a variety of national security challenges, including the one that we'll discuss today. Thank you.
HARUMFA, Mr. Dwyer. Okay. Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet is the CEO of Ocean STL Consulting, where he's a strategic advisor for a variety of startups, nonprofits, and research institutions. We previously worked together when Admiral Gallaudet served as the acting and deputy administrator of NOAA and the acting undersecretary and assistant secretary of commerce for oceans and atmosphere. Before NOAA, the Admiral served for 32 years in the U.S. Navy, retiring as the oceanographer of the Navy and director of the Navy's Task Force on Climate Change. Mackenzie Eaglin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she works on defense strategy, defense budgets, and military readiness. Ms. Eaglin is also one of the 12-member U.S. Army War College Board of Visitors and serves on the U.S. Army Science Board. In 2023, she became a member of the Commission on the Future of the Navy, established by Congress to study the strategy, budget, and policies concerning the future strength of the U.S. Navy fleet. Before joining AEI, Ms. Eaglin worked on defense issues in the House of Representatives, in the U.S. Senate, and at the Pentagon in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and on the Joint Staff. With that, let me turn the hearing over to Admiral McGinn, and each of you has 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Your full testimony will be made a part of the record of this hearing. Admiral McGinn, to you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse and Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify today on the critical impact of climate change on our national security. My views are based on more than 35 years of active duty service in the United States Navy. As former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment, and as a business executive in the private sector focusing on the security challenges of climate change related to our energy portfolio, economy, and our environment. To begin, I can strongly state that climate change is a significant and growing national security budget challenge. Business as usual is not a viable or attractive option. It is in our immediate and long-term interest to prioritize and allocate sufficient resources to adequately address both mitigation and adaptation. Harkening back to my days as a fighter pilot, we used the term a bogey-rich environment when you're surrounded by threats, and clearly the United States is in a bogey-rich environment. No matter which way we turn, it seems, Senator Grassley pointed out many of those, there seems to be another challenge. But we need to continue to address all of those bogeys in an appropriate way, and I think that the focus of today's discussion on climate change is very, very appropriate and clearly has tremendous implications for our large and growing national debt as well, if it's left unchecked. Needed attention to those climate threats and other global challenges goes beyond traditional national security priorities. However, it must be aligned and integrated with them. China's posture in Asia and around the world, for example, is informed by growing environmental degradation, water scarcity, and food insecurity. Chinese leadership has set priorities and made economic choices to invest in renewable energy and electric vehicles because they see the direction the world is going and the opportunity it presents. Similarly, Russia's posture, especially in the Arctic, is inextricably linked to the receding ice and increased access to resources in that region. The Russians see both opportunity and threats across their vast northern frontier. In the past, Congress has explicitly acknowledged the security impacts of climate change as a direct threat to U.S. national security. The pragmatic, bipartisan approach Congress has taken needs to be broadened to include the significant economic and budgetary implications that climate change brings. For example, the growing benefits of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act will not only help to meet the climate challenge, but will also create significant economic, health, and security opportunities. In the Department of Defense, there's been a serious recognition, as pointed out by the chairman, of the threat, recognition that climate change will continue to drive instability around the world, recognition that the opening Arctic will create new dimensions in great power competition, recognition that extreme weather events will create readiness challenges, humanitarian crises, and stressful conditions in which our military will have to operate. Climate change is different, however, from traditional military threats. It isn't defined by a specific enemy, timeline, or geographical area. However, the adverse effects of climate change, including typhoons, flooding, wildfires, drought, disease, crop failure, and migration of large populations, including here in our own hemisphere, create more frequent, intense, and widespread natural and humanitarian disasters. These events magnify existing geopolitical tensions in critical regions, overwhelming fragile political, economic, and social structures, causing them, in many cases, to fail. The CNA Military Advisory Board, 17 years ago, in 2007, reported national security and the threat of climate change served as a threat multiplier in critical regions of national interest around the world. 10 years ago this month, The same Military Advisory Board updated report, National Security and the Accelerating Risks of Climate Change, defined it as a, quote, catalyst for instability and conflict. The objective analysis and cumulative military wisdom evident in these reports clearly warn about more frequent and demanding missions for our men and women in uniform, both here at home and abroad. The clear message, climate readiness is mission readiness. In summary, the military has understood for many years the threats to operational missions and installation infrastructure that climate change poses. Consequently, the Department of Defense has significantly elevated its program priority and started to increase the resources allocated to meet this challenge. In order to fully ensure that our essential national security capabilities continue to be strong and resilient in the face of the climate challenges ahead, DoD needs your continuing focus on this growing threat and unwavering budgetary support. Working together, we can create a better future in which American national security is stronger, more sustainable, and in which we can turn climate challenges into actual opportunity. Thank you, Senators, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Now to you, Director Sikorsky.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify before you today. As a Wisconsin native, Senator Johnson, it's nice to see you in this room as well. My remarks are informed by my position as the director of the Center for Climate and Security, but also the many years that I served as a senior analyst in the U.S. intelligence community, including on the U.S. National Intelligence Council. I'm going to talk about both the direct and indirect security risks posed by climate change. As climate-driven hazards grow more frequent and intense, we're seeing militaries regularly on the front lines of response. In the past 22 months, the Center for Climate and Security's Military Response to Climate Hazards Tracker, or MIRCH, not quite as good of an acronym, has identified nearly 300 deployments by militaries in 74 countries to fight fires, rescue citizens from floods, deliver water, or participate in other hazard-related activities. Here in the U.S., troops have deployed 70 times since June 2022. And of course, the U.S. military has also responded globally during that time period, supporting response efforts in Pakistan, the Philippines, Libya, and Canada. This demand is almost certain to grow as temperatures rise. Climate risks also, though, impact U.S. competitors' and adversaries' security. Open source analysis of 34 Russian airfields in the Arctic found evidence of damage likely due to permafrost thaw at 27 of them, including some facilities that were beyond repair. Turning east, a paper I wrote on China's own climate security vulnerabilities identified that country's coastal shipyards and artificial islands as increasingly vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme precipitation. Moving on to indirect risks, as an intelligence officer, I spent years analyzing threats of terrorism and insurgency in the Middle East and Africa. And while I was doing that, I regularly saw climate-related hazards such as drought, extreme precipitation, and heat waves contribute to food and water insecurity. I watched such dynamics strain governments and provide terrorist and insurgent groups opportunities to gain a foothold among vulnerable populations and countries of key national security concern for the United States. Climate-driven food and water insecurity also contribute to irregular migration. Take Central America, which was a region identified as a key area of concern by the U.S. intelligence community in the National Intelligence Estimate mentioned by Senator Whitehouse earlier. Research shows that drier than normal periods in the region are associated with increased emigration to the U.S. Climate models, of course, project that Central America is a global hotspot for future decreases in precipitation or more drought due to climate change. The good news is, and I think relevant for the Budget Committee, is this is a problem the U.S. can get ahead of by investing in upstream adaptation and resilience programs aimed at addressing food insecurity and climate hazards. In Honduras, for example, people who received USAID agricultural investments in recent years reported an intention to migrate that was 78% lower than the country overall. I'd like to end by turning again to the Indo-Pacific, where the U.S.'s global network of allies and partners is one of its primary comparative advantages in competition with China. More and more, the number one issue facing many of those partners is climate change. In 2022, the defense minister from Fiji said, "In our blue Pacific continent, machine guns, fighter jets, gray ships, and green battalions are not our primary security concern. The single greatest threat to our very existence is climate change." And similarly, there was a survey in 2024 of ASEAN member nations about their greatest challenges in the region. The threat of climate change outranked the threat from military tensions by more than 10 points. Given these dynamics, competing with China and investing in climate resilience for U.S. allies and partners are not contradictory goals, right? It's not one or the other. In fact, they're complementary. Retired Admiral Sam Locklear and I wrote an op-ed last year that noted, helping allies and partners manage climate risks not only shows them that the U.S. is attentive to their needs, it can also build their resilience so they're available when the U.S. needs them. It's a win-win. We pointed to Papua New Guinea as one example, a target of intense Chinese attention in recent years. Papua New Guinea faces high risks of climate-driven sea level rise, strengthened typhoons, and a lack of fresh water. In June 2023, the U.S. signed a new security pact with the country, getting access to develop and operate out of PNG bases. But to sustain this presence, the U.S. is going to need reliable energy sources, clean, fresh water, and an economically vibrant, healthy local population. For this reason, investments in climate resilience and adaptation in such a country are investments in U.S. national security and need to be prioritized. In closing, for many years now, Congress has shown bipartisan leadership toward addressing the security risks of climate change I've discussed today, as Admiral McGinn noted. As climate hazards intensify in the coming decades, continued congressional leadership will be critical to ensure the U.S. makes the investments needed to manage the security risks of a warming world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning Admiral Locklear, who's been a very helpful voice on this. The ranking member referenced Admiral Mullen. I think it's not for nothing that it's admirals who are particularly focused on all of this, because Navy bases are at particular risk, which brings us to Mr. Dwyer. Please proceed.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Senator Kaine, for that introduction and explaining our Harumph acronym to everybody else here. But Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the impacts of climate change on our national security from a defense community perspective. Our organization represents the 16 local governments and our private sector partners in southeastern Virginia. This is an extremely important issue that our region has been tackling for many years. It will take a continued close partnership between federal partners and state and local entities to ensure the impacts of climate change are effectively mitigated to avoid harming national security. Hampton Roads is home to the largest concentration of military installations and personnel in the country. Our region has been an integral part of the military since the birth of our nation, and the strategic value of Hampton Roads was recognized even before our independence. Norfolk Naval Shipyard is the largest and oldest of the 4 Navy-owned shipyards and was established in 1767 by the British. Naval Station Norfolk is the largest Navy base in the world and home port to our East Coast-based aircraft carriers. The area boasts significant air power with the Navy's East Coast Master Jet Base at NAS Oceana and Joint Base Langley Eustis, which is home to over 40% of the Air Force's F-22s and Air Combat Command. Fort Eustis is home to the Army's Navy, from which units recently deployed to build the floating pier off the coast of Gaza. And Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek Fort Story is the East Coast hub of the Navy SEALs. There are more Coast Guard personnel stationed in our region than anywhere else in the country. And we also host the largest concentration of private sector naval ship repair capability, as well as the only builder of aircraft carriers and one of only 2 builders of submarines. Needless to say, supporting the military is part of who we are as a region. Hampton Roads sits at the confluence of the Chesapeake Bay, James, and York rivers, which makes it susceptible to rising sea levels. We have seen impacts from climate change for a number of years now. For example, workers at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard sometimes must be sent home early due to potential roadway flooding on and off the installation, which has a very tangible impact on timeliness and cost of ship repairs. Normal access to parts of some bases can also be cut off from heavy rain flooding and storm surge events. These issues have spurred us to work with our military partners to make our region and installations more resilient. The first Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation Joint Land Use Study in the country, focused solely on sea level rise and persistent flooding, happened between Langley Air Force Base and the city of Hampton in 2018. 2 additional studies with the Navy in Virginia Beach and Norfolk, and then Chesapeake and Portsmouth followed soon thereafter. These projects and issues identified during the collaborative efforts provide roadmaps for our installations and communities to work together to make both entities more resilient. However, the challenges of climate change are not limited to the Hampton Roads area. The FY18 NDAA required DoD to provide a list of installations that were impacted by climate change. Of the 79 priority installations examined, over 2/3 were impacted by climate-related events. And when other threats are included, there is no single military installation in the country that is immune from the impacts of climate change or natural disasters. The rising awareness of climate change impacts on military bases has led to the development of authorities and resources to mitigate these issues, such as the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, the Energy Resilience and Conservation Investment Program, and the Installation Resilience Program. These tools will help leverage existing military construction and O&M funds to address resiliency on military installations. However, the key to success of these programs is continuous cooperation between local stakeholders and the military. Fixes to a base alone won't solve the problem. Given 70 to 80% of our military members live in the surrounding community, it doesn't do much good to make an installation resilient if personnel can't get there to perform the mission. We applaud that Congress understands this dynamic and has enabled a number of authorities that encourage this type of partnership. But the resources provided these programs are simply not enough to keep up with the demand and impacts of climate change on military installations. There are also policy challenges to overcome. One noted example is that the Army Corps of Engineers is not allowed to include federal properties when conducting civil works-funded coastal resiliency studies. This problem became evident when the Corps' 2019 study of Norfolk did not include the world's largest Navy base, leaving a vital national security asset unprotected. Obtaining a cost share from one other federal agency is hard enough, but imagine trying to coordinate funding from 7 different federal agencies for a pending coastal study on the peninsula of Hampton Roads. We greatly appreciate the Senate addressing this issue in the 2022 Water Resources Development Act, but unfortunately the Senate language was not included in the final bill. But Congress has a chance to remedy this policy issue in this year's WRDA legislation. We appreciate that the committee is looking into this matter with greater oversight. We believe there are 2 main areas where Congress can help address the challenges posed by climate change to our bases. First, increasing resources for existing infrastructure and resiliency programs that help DoD and communities address climate change. And second, fixing policy challenges such as the Civil Works Authority prohibiting inclusion of federal properties in resiliency studies. Solutions to the impact of climate change on our military bases must take a comprehensive approach, as floodwaters and other threats don't care about fence lines or jurisdictional boundaries. That can only be done when Congress provides authorities that direct such collaboration from federal partners, as well as require local input. The challenges posed by climate change to our national defense are real and daunting, and Congress has taken positive steps in providing authorities and resources, but more is needed. I thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Hampton Road region's work with our military partners and appreciate your consideration of our recommendations. And I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Dwyer. Admiral Gallaudet.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding climate change and national security. Having been in charge of NOAA, America's top climate science agency, and having led the U.S. Navy's Task Force Climate Change, I agree that climate change is indeed an important topic. When it comes to national security, certain changes to the planet's climate are concerning, and my fellow witnesses have addressed this. However, I find it unfortunate that the approach to climate change by the Department of Defense under the Biden administration is deeply flawed. Consider the 2022 National Security Strategy, which claims that climate change is the existential challenge of our time. This is an unfounded claim. It assumes that we know with certainty that global-scale, life-threatening change will occur, and our species will be unable to adapt to that change. Both points are problematic. For one, climate projections are rife with uncertainty, and secondly, our species has proved to be quite resilient through significant climatic changes in the past. Thirdly, a majority, if not all, of the scientific literature pointing to disastrous outcomes for humanity due to climate change employ implausible emission scenarios. Even the administration's EPA has adopted more realistic scenarios recently where global emissions begin to decrease mid-century. Personally, I view Russia's intention of developing an indiscriminate nuclear weapon in space as a potential existential threat, or perhaps an asteroid impact on the planet, which NASA is preparing for because we know an extinction event was caused by one in the past. The cost-imposing security threats we should be talking about here are obvious. Russia's war on Ukraine, the war between Israel and Hamas supported by a nuclear-aspiring Iran, strikes by Iranian proxies on global shipping and U.S. assets in the Middle East, and China's Navy eclipsing that of the U.S. to become the world's largest with its sights set on taking Taiwan in the near future. None of these were generated by or made significantly worse by climate change. Another failing in the DoD's approach regards the DoD climate risk analysis released in 2021. A disquieting aspect of this document is the complete absence of citations of peer-reviewed scientific research regarding the climate trends it identifies. In fact, the climate risk analysis presents no actual analysis at all. Indeed, it simply asserts a range of security implications resulting from climate change. The problem with these assertions is they are too vague to make sound investment decisions, and they lack the analytical rigor required by standard defense risk analyses. And in some cases, they're flat out wrong. For example, in the foreword to the DoD Climate Risk Analysis, Secretary Austin states that typhoons are occurring at an unprecedented scale. Not a single scientific study supports that statement. In fact, the frequency of major hurricanes and typhoons has seen no upward or downward change over the past 4 decades. A final fault in the DoD's approach is its emphasis on greenhouse gas emissions. The Department of the Navy has prioritized mitigating climate change by establishing targets for reducing emissions, and the Army has done the same. Reaching such targets will have a near zero impact on net global emissions, warming, and climate change. The DoD was responsible for only 1% of the 5 billion metric tons of U.S. CO2 emissions in 2021. This pales in comparison to China's, which was 10 billion metric tons. So the Navy's objective to reduce emissions is a dangerous distraction from its need to deter the security threats I mentioned previously. But I do not mean to dismiss the good work the department is doing to adapt to climate change. For example, I strongly support the first line of effort in the DoD Climate Adaptation Plan, climate-informed decision-making. I'll even say that the DoD needs to invest more in this area. The most effective way to prepare for climate change is to improve short-term, sub-seasonal, and seasonal forecasts for weather, water, and ice. This can be accomplished by expanding the network of environmental observation systems, including satellites, buoys, ships, and drones, as well as improving the numerical models used to predict the state of the physical environment. Such improvements do not require significant growth in the Pentagon's budget. As NASA has done with SpaceX, the DoD can accelerate its climate readiness by partnering with the private sector, where a variety of innovative startups are providing the tools that can help the U.S. military prevail in any operational environment. I close with a development that is more germane to the Committee on the Budget. This year, federal spending for interest on our national debt is forecast to hit $870 billion, exceeding the DoD budget for the first time. Combined with inflation, such a dramatic drop in the Pentagon's purchasing power is perhaps a greater threat to our national security than climate change. I recommend the committee hold future hearings on topics which focus on our increasingly unsustainable fiscal situation. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And next is Ms. Eaglin.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse. Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you this morning about this important topic. Climate change is an important but shared concern by individuals, companies and businesses, and governments around the world. Should it be needed, however, using violence in the name of the state is uniquely and exclusively the responsibility of the federal government. The world as it is today shows us that the peace does not keep itself. An ounce of deterrence is worth much more than a pound of war. So while the military budget is large for peacetime, it's a relative bargain should we wind up in direct conflict. 2 wars of our partners and allies in the Middle East and in Europe, trying to maintain open sea lanes and commercial shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and preventing an outbreak right now, at this very moment in Scarborough, requires a global military with power projection and reach across 3 theaters of Eurasia and the Middle East. As has already been noted this morning by Ranking Member Grassley and my colleagues, the defense budget is matched this year by interest payments on the debt, and defense is declining across any lens through which you look at it. In real terms, as a percentage of the federal budget, and as a percentage of the United States economy and what we can afford. In fact, defense is now smaller than non-defense discretionary spending in the federal budget. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party has seen 30 straight years of defense budget increases. Their average annual increase for their defense budget is 9% versus our 1%. Of course, that's typically below inflation. These are all still inputs, however. The outputs of these investments are what matters. Bolstering our conventional and strategic deterrence to prevent war and allow prosperity for the American people is the mission of our armed forces. They are spread thin and require sustained commitment. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We seem to have agreement that the major areas of concern relate to climate effects on military infrastructure, climate effects on military operations and climate effects producing the kind of conflicts to which the military will have to respond. Is that a pretty fair summary of the problem set here, Admiral McGinn?
It is, Mr. Chairman. I would add, however, we have not delved into what the military can and should be and is doing to reduce greenhouse gases. This is not a question of doing adaptability and adjustments and not being able to do greenhouse gas reduction. The criterion in speaking with Department of Defense leaders for doing greenhouse gas reduction is it directly related to the mission. So if we are electrifying forward operating bases that the Marines are using to reduce the reliance on long, vulnerable supply chains of diesel oil, that is directly related to the mission, and it gives their capability much, much more. There are many examples of this, but I would say that the focus on greenhouse gas reductions in many cases in the Department of Defense and the services focuses on efficiency, getting more bang for the buck, getting more military capability, more time on station, longer ranges, greater payloads by being much more efficient. However, it's also good to invest in the kinds of technology, many of which are helping our entire society in terms of economic development, and have the Department of Defense not just talk the talk about greenhouse gas reduction, but walk the walk and lead by example as we have in any crisis in the past.
Director Sikorsky, same question.
Yes, I agree. I think those are the three key areas to talk about. I would make two additional points. One is that addressing those threats is not just about the defense budget, it's also about other agencies such as USAID and the State Department, where they can make those upstream resilience investments. And then the second point I would make is I don't see climate change as separate from some of the other challenges that have been talked about here today, like China and Russia. The International Security Advisory Board of the State Department recently released a new report on new threats and challenges, and they have a case study in there about Taiwan and a conflict over Taiwan, and they look at how climate hazards might actually shape such a conflict and risk U.S. forces and supply chains and ability to conduct operations there. So these things need to be looked at, I think, together, not separately.
Mr. Dwyer, do you concur?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I concur with those assessments. And from a local host perspective, again, we're looking at it from our community and our installation resilience perspective. And and from our perspective, the focus needs to be on adapting and mitigating those effects.
And let me ask Admiral McGinn and Director Sikorsky from a military-wide perspective, and Mr. Dwyer from a Naval Station Norfolk perspective, do you feel that the data is inadequate to justify the decisions that are being made to reduce climate risk as regards to infrastructure operations and conflict?
I do believe it's adequate. However, more data and better analysis, as you know, sir, is always good. And I think that we are doing common sense, mission-focused measures and policies and investments in the Department of Defense that is based on an adequate level of data, but at the same time, everybody realizes we need to learn more.
Director Sikorsky?
Yes, I agree with Admiral McGinn, and I think in many cases we've done the analysis and risk assessment, and now it's about action and moving forward. I do agree with Admiral Gallaudet as well that sub-seasonal forecasting, getting better understandings, especially in places like Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East where we don't have a lot of good data, would be helpful in making risk assessments.
And I still got a chance for Mr. Dwyer to answer with regards to your sense in your planning around Harumfa of whether you think you're doing that based on inadequate data and wasting people's time.
So the data we most look at in our region in terms of resiliency of our communities and the installations is the amount of sea level rise. So how much is the water going. And I don't think there's any dispute in terms of the data, in terms of how much it's risen. Naval Station Norfolk, or there's a tide gauge right near Naval Station Norfolk that's, if it's not the oldest, it's one of the oldest tide gauges in the country. And it's shown that we've had about 18 inches of sea level rise.
Maybe even a NOAA tide gauge.
Yeah, I believe it is, sir. But about 18 inches of sea level rise since, I think, 1930. So that's data that nobody can argue with.
Senator Grassley.
Thank you. Admiral
And then
Gallaudet, I'm going
Senator
to
Kane.
quote from the Defense Department's 2022 National Defense Strategy concerns about China. The most, quote, "the most comprehensive and serious challenge to the United States national security is PRC's coercive and increasingly aggressive endeavor to refashion the Indo-Pacific region and the international system to suit its interests and authoritarian preferences," end of quote. Do you agree with the Pentagon that China is a greater threat to national security than climate change?
Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. I do agree. I believe that China is a greater threat and is imposing more significant costs than climate change by orders of magnitude. And you can see it everywhere we look. They're buying land near U.S. military bases. Their surveillance balloons have been invading our airspace. They are challenging our allies and challenging us all around the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific, through unsafe, assertive, provocative military activities. And their Navy, as I said, has eclipsed our U.S. Navy as being the largest in the world. And they're also doing significant environmental harm to our allies by destroying coral reefs in the South China Sea. And their illegal fishing, which is a global phenomenon, is just undermining the blue economies of our partners and allies. So yes, China is absolutely more of a greater threat. And I think we know that they are going to invade Taiwan in the near future. And that's the threat we should be talking about here.
Admiral, to you also, not only are you the only climate scientist testifying today, you've served as the oceanographer of the Navy and head of NOAA. Those are jobs where you have to follow scientific evidence and not ideology, because lives are often at stake. So question, in your view, how credible are the assertions that climate change is going to increase the frequency of extreme weather events like typhoons and hurricanes? And do you see much scientific evidence supporting the claim?
Thank you, Senator Grassley. I think we need to be more precise in the way we talk about extreme events caused by climate change. For example, as you stated, typhoons and hurricanes, there's been no upward or downward trend since 1980 worldwide. Now, some models do point to increasing intensification of those storms in the end of the century, but those are often models using extreme emission scenarios, as I said in my statement. And in terms of attribution science, the National Academies of Science 2016 report, they ranked with very low confidence being able to attribute tropical cyclones or any one given tropical cyclone to climate change. And that includes the Tyndall Air Force Base hurricane, Hurricane Michael, that destroyed that facility, as well as the Typhoon Mawar that caused damage on Guam. And I think also there's another point we should talk about, and that's wildfires. Looking at the data from the National Interagency Wildfire Center, there's been no change in the trend of wildfires since 1980. And I think another more important problem when we talk about wildfires is the fact that you really can't decouple easily, if at all, the other causal factors for wildfire frequency throughout the U.S., and that's things like land management and forest management practices.
And Ms. Edelin, accordingly to official sources, China has a defense budget of $230 billion, but like many statistics published by the country's communist government, the numbers are very suspect. How much do you estimate China is really spending on its military? How does this compare to what the U.S. is spending on defense?
Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. So the American intelligence community about a year ago stated that China spends about $700 billion on its defense budget. but no more information was provided. So at AEI, we tried to recreate as best we could our own assessment and came up with a number at least 3 times as large as what the Chinese Communist Party puts out through its state media annually, as you noted, at $230 billion. It's using conservative estimates, at least $711 billion, for including many things that we would include, for example, in our defense budget that Beijing does not, for example, military research and development, space activities, rocket forces, for many paramilitary organizations as well, Coast Guard, maritime militias, People's Armed Police. When you add all of these things up and account for some other adjustments and exchanges and purchasing power parity, it's easily at par with the United States budget for 2022. We estimate 96% of our own budget in size.
Senator Grassley,
Kane.
if I may, there's an old Russian proverb that says, "Shoot the wolf closest to the sleigh." Well, this sleigh of national security that the United States has is surrounded by a lot of wolves or threats. And the problem that we can get in trying to compare a threat like China, for example, big and growing, or what is going on with Russia and Ukraine and what is happening in the Middle East, is that they are so urgent that they can take our attention and our resources away from threats that are even greater, but they're just not as urgent. So we need to balance the urgent against the important in the longer term.
Senator Kane, followed by Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Chair, and to the witnesses. I appreciate it. I'll pick up on Admiral McGinn's on urgency. This is already urgent in Virginia. The sea level rise in Hampton Roads is imposing significant costs on our military installations, but also in our communities. And it's also urgent in one other area of Virginia, the extreme nature of rainfall in Appalachian, Virginia, which on an annualized basis isn't changing much. It's just coming in many more violent episodes. And the infrastructure there was just not built for it. So roads, schools, it wasn't built for the violence of storms. And so pretty much every year we end up with a massive kind of FEMA event in the Appalachian region of Virginia. You did a good job, Rick, in talking about the programs that are already out there. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. We work on these a lot, the Defense Community Infrastructure Program and others. We're doing a good job on that. And you talked a little bit about the impact on operations in Hampton Roads. When you have the main road serving the biggest and most important naval base in the world, more and more likely to flood, just under normal tidal action now, not even talking about storms or extreme events. And that's a resilience problem that we have to invest. And I am pretty pleased with the work of the NDAA and the Armed Services Committee in putting more priority toward these resilience investments. But one piece of your testimony, I just wanted to make sure my committee colleagues understand, because I do think we have enough data, but this issue about how when the Army Corps does their assessments of what's needed, that they don't take into account the federal facilities. I mean, in Hampton Roads, which is the center of naval power in the world, it's not just the main naval base. I mean, we have 18 different military installations and annexes in Hampton Roads, plus the Hampton VA, Fort Monroe National Monument, NASA Langley, 5 different National Wildlife Refuge, Jefferson National Labs, and even more federal facilities, the Portsmouth Naval Hospital. Explain again to the committee what the change we need to make in either WORD or the NDAA to enable the Army Corps to include federal facilities when they're doing planning about resilience investments.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. The issue boils down to those resiliency funding studies are funded through the Civil Works Program. And so based on the Economy Act and the Corps' interpretation of that, they can't mix funding streams. So if they're going to include a different federal agency's lands in that study, that's a non-civilian agency, they have to get, that agency has to pay their share to participate in the study. And the reason the naval base was left out of it, lots of times the Corps doesn't find out until the money is dropped on them when they're going to get funding for these studies. So that when they approach the Navy about participating in that 2018 or 2019 study, that installation commander didn't have, $400,000 or $500,000 laying around that he could participate in. I would like to say the Navy's learned from that. They're now participating in the Virginia Beach study that started last year. They are paying to play in that. But as you mentioned, the real concern is the study that the Corps just found out they got money for in December. 7 different federal agencies on the peninsula, military, NASA, Department
Coast-
of Energy.
Coast Guard, yeah.
And people can argue that DOD's got the money to pay for it. The Park Service, NASA, Coast Guard, some of their budgets don't stack up and don't have those.
Well, oftentimes we run into this problem where we silo things to our detriment, and we need to be looking at the region comprehensively, especially with all the federal facilities. It was good that in word of the last version of it, the Senate tried to correct this. It's unfortunate that that was not included in the ultimate compromise that was reached with the House, but whether as part of WRDA or the NDA, we're going to make another run at it this year so that we can, again, take advantage of the data that we have and actually have comprehensive assessments about what we should do. Last thing, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to spend a minute bragging on Virginia. We're not just a basket case. We're not just a problem child. Hampton Roads is second most vulnerable to sea level rise after New Orleans and the Appalachian Challenge, as I mentioned. But in recent years, Virginia has become a real leader in clean energy. When I came into the Senate in 2012, we were bottom half of the nation in solar deployment, for example. Now, by most measures, we're top 10. And I'm proud to have played my own little part in that together with state legislators and our governors. We were nowhere in the wind space, and now we're a national leader in offshore wind. Part of what we're doing to improve resilience in the Port of Hampton Roads will enable us to better serve offshore wind off the coast of Virginia and the Outer Banks. So the fact that we have moved from laggard to leader, at least in two clean energy spaces, solar and offshore wind, is positive. And just last week, the Biden administration announced with the Virginia DOD installations, together with Dominion, our largest utility, that we will reach 100% clean energy for our DOD facilities in Virginia by 2030. And we're excited because you're right, it may not, in the global scheme of things, maybe that's a tiny percentage, but our military has always been a leader. When the military desegregated after World War II, that was a signal that led to significant positive social change. And if the military can lead in this space, it will not only be good because we will be producing our own energy and not relying on others we needn't, but it will also send an important signal that I think others are likely to follow. So thank you for this hearing today, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Kane. Next is Senator Johnson, followed by Senator Van Hollen, and then Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start again as I normally do in these hearings. I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not an alarmist. Climate has always changed, always will. We'll have to adapt. Let me start asking any of the witnesses. Anybody know how much the sea level has increased in the Bay of San Francisco since the last glaciation period, 12 to 20,000 years ago? Anybody? Mr. Dwyer, you're concerned about 18 inches, undeniable. Anyone take a guess? 390 feet. Do you think there's anything we could have done to prevent the sea level rising 390 feet over the last, let's say, 20,000 years? The answer to that is no, okay? The Vostok ice core sample shows 5 pretty distinct cycles of temperature variation of almost 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything we could have done to stop that? Anybody know how much we've spent globally on trying to turn back the tides to prevent climate change? Anybody have an estimate of that? We had a witness from AEI estimate about $5 trillion. This is before the Inflation Reduction Act that claims about $400 billion. Goldman Sachs says really about 1.2. So let's say it's $6 trillion of spending globally trying to combat climate change. Have we impacted climate change at all? Yeah, I still see the same level of hair on fire alarmism. Got to spend more money. To what effect?
Senator, as a veteran of nearly 200 combat missions and over 1,000 carrier landings in high-performance jets, I have never been accused of being an alarmist. I have been accused of being very analytical, data-driven, and I think that
You
yes,
didn't know that the sea level had risen 390 feet. Don't you think that's an important data point when you're assessing climate change?
It isn't in the human lifespan as important.
But the human lifespan, we're a blip in these major geologic trends. We're a blip. Now, you can blow up that blip and turn to an alarmism Admiral Gwynn, let me ask you a question. You're into business now, right?
Yes.
What kind of business are you in?
I'm in the business of energy, environment, and economy.
And what does that business do?
Well, basically, taking a look at the opportunities that we have to transition from our energy portfolio, which is primarily and has for good reasons been relying on fossil fuel.
Who are your clients?
I'm not going to share those right now because of non-disclosure
Is it
agreements.
say it's a lot, maybe Defense Department and the government?
No, it's not. No.
Would you say that your opportunities spring from the fact that, we have this climate change crisis on our hands, creating opportunities for your business?
It's not an opportunity that springs from climate change. It's an opportunity to increase economic development and create jobs.
So we've talked a lot about studies, right? Anybody read the Wall Street Journal article today about a publisher named Wiley? Been around for 217 years, is shutting down 19 journals because over the last 2 years, they've had to retract 11,300 fraudulent research studies. Has anybody listened to President Eisenhower's farewell address recently? Not only did he warn us about the military-industrial complex, which we have not heeded that warning at all. Second warning was he warned us about public government financing of science and research, implying that if government's funding research, those scientists are going to be more concerned about getting a research grant, turning a crisis into an opportunity, and that would corrupt science. We've known about fraudulent research studies now for decades. We just haven't talked about it. We've ignored it. We've covered it up. But I would argue fraudulent research is probably fueling more of the climate alarmism, creating opportunities than anything else. I'm just not buying the science. When you take a look at actual science, like 390 feet sea level rise, like the Vostok ice core sample. Do you realize that CO2 in those Vostok ice core graphs is a lagging indicator? Temperature rises first, then CO2 comes later. Did anybody realize that? Admiral, did you want to comment on that? You're a PhD on this.
I do want to comment on that, Senator Johnson. Thank you. I think it is true that there is a bias in the media and some scientific journals towards negative reporting of climate change impacts. You never believe this if you, in view of the administration's trove of climate directives, but many climate indices related to human and society well-being have been on an upward trend for the last 50 years, despite the 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming that's occurred. And this is things like crop yields and calories per individual. And these are global statistics you can go find on our World in Data. Things like death rates due to natural disasters, the incidences of diseases related to climate like malaria, those are going down. Malnutrition and famine, those trends are also going down. And then extreme poverty throughout the world has also plummeted. So there's a lot of positive results of technology and our energy posture, frankly. And right now there are 3 billion people who are in an energy poverty status. I encourage everyone to look up the Breakthrough Institute and see the recent article by Dr. Patrick Brown on this topic.
My final comment, just imagine the human suffering we could have alleviated spending $5 to $6 trillion trying to alleviate that rather than hold back the tides, which we won't be able to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just for the record, the last time that I can recall that somebody accused a climate scientist of engaging in fraud, there was actually a lawsuit. And Dr. Mann won the lawsuit and got a $1 million judgment against the individual who had accused him of fraud. So when that proposition is tested in real life against a real individual, the courts straighten it out pretty quickly. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right, I find this conversation a little detached from reality, especially in light of the hearing that we had in the Budget Committee a short time ago where it was very clear that the big oil companies' own research and investigation indicated that their carbon emissions were major contributors to climate change. And in terms of putting a bias on top of it, it was clear from their own documents that they had then worked to cover up the fact that the science showed that their contributions to climate change were real. I mean, these are facts. These were documents that were disclosed, and I thank the chairman for having that hearing. Back to the immediate impact that we're witnessing, and not just globally, not just nationally, but close to home. Like Virginia, Maryland is home to many military installations. We have 24 military installations in Maryland. About half of them are coastal. Climate change has been a big factor in the sea level rise that we've seen in the Chesapeake Bay, over a foot over the last 100 years, and projected to rise up to another 6 feet over the next 100 years. And so this is impacting our military installations. Annapolis, of course, is home to the U.S. Naval Academy. We're very proud to have it in the state of Maryland. That broke records in 2019 with almost 20 days of high tide flooding, up from an average of 2 days per year from 1995 to 2005. And the Naval Academy has taken steps to address sea level rise, including a $37.5 million project to raise the height of the seawall to protect part of the Academy. Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Northeast Maryland is the site of important Army research. That's dependent on Aberdeen's high-tech infrastructure, and it is also threatened by sea level rise. For example, the Army Research Lab relies on an Aberdeen testing site nearby, Pasuti Island, which is expected to be completely underwater in 50 years. So, Mr. Dwyer, thank you again for the work that you've done on this issue. In your testimony, you cite how consistent underinvestment in infrastructure has created a maintenance and modernization backlog of about $49 billion for the Navy and $47 billion for the Air Force. So do you believe that this is an area where we should be investing more in order to protect our military assets?
Senator, thank you for that question. The answer is yes. I do believe that we need to be investing more in the infrastructure of our DoD installations. You mentioned the backlog. That's just from historical decades of underfunding. Like I said, when I was a second lieutenant back in 1996, I was told right when I came in that we're taking risk in infrastructure. That's why we don't have enough funding to do what we need to do on the installations. And that's been the mantra ever since. And so now we've got these huge backlog of bills. And I think the 25 budget request is requesting about $37 billion in DoD for MILCON and FSRM funding, $1.3 trillion plant replacement value. So we're at about a little less than 3% investment, and a lot of that investment is for new mission bed downs, COCOM requirements, so not recapitalizing and investing in our existing infrastructure. Industry standard is about 4 to 6% investment every year just in keeping your facilities in good condition and recapitalizing them.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, look, obviously we have ongoing maintenance requirements apart from climate change, but the reality is at places like the Naval Academy, the additional costs are necessary because of what we're seeing. Admiral Begin, again, thank you for your service. You speak in your testimony about climate change as a, quote, catalyst for instability and conflict, unquote. So do you agree that our efforts to make a transition toward clean energy is not only in our interests from an economic point of view, from an environmental point of view, but also from a national security point of view?
Yes, sir, I do. In the broadest sense, our national security is comprised of three big pillars: our energy security, our economic security, and our environmental security. They directly lead to our quality of life and our safety and our health. And so fossil fuel has been fantastic for this country and many parts of the world, not all, in terms of giving us the kind of economies and quality of life that we have. But it's time to change. Just as we had to change years ago when we thought that asbestos was a great insulator, or DDT was a great insect control mechanism, or that leaded paint was a terrific substance to use inside and outside of homes. What happened was there was analysis that was done, medical research done, and we realized that despite all of the benefits of things, there's a downside. And we have come to realize, and you cited the fossil fuel industry's own research, that there's a downside to continued use, unmitigated use of fossil fuels. So it's time to switch to another way of powering our economy and powering our way of life, and literally creating a much stronger national security because of that.
Senator Van Hollen, if I may, as a fellow Maryland resident, and even though my comments about wildfires and typhoons were directed at the need to be more precise in what's occurring, I'll fully support Mr. Dwyer's testimony, and I've lived it firsthand. I've seen the increase in inundation and high tide flooding where I lived in North Beach, Maryland. I've just moved to Annapolis. I've seen what's happened to the Academy. I applaud those investments, and I agree we need to invest more in our infrastructure and installations, and I'm especially interested because my daughter starts at Annapolis next month.
Well, listen, thank you, and it's good to see you, and thank you as well for your service and your testimony. And we are very proud of the Naval Academy, and congratulations on your daughter. Thank you.
Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we do have a couple admirals on the panel. I want to quote one. Back in 2010, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, stated that the most significant threat to our national security is our debt. 2010. That is back when it was so much less than what it is now. Back in 2010, it was probably around 15, 16 trillion. It was a lot less. I know it was 18 trillion when I got here in 18. Jamie Dimon and Jerome Powell in the last couple months have said our national debt and the service of it, which is now denominated in trillions, $1 trillion a year, is the same as our defense budget. That finally, the two biggest finance guys in the world said enough is enough, and that the dark clouds of our economy in the future would be the behavior of this place. On March 20th, in this body, I introduced a resolution that passed by unanimous consent that debt is a threat to our national security. Remember, this is the Budget Committee. And we haven't run a balanced budget since the late 90s. I want to distill this into very simple terms. Senator Johnson was talking about all the elements that go into the past, the present, and the future, the modeling that's been nowhere close, and the money, the time value of money that we are starting to spend on something that is amorphous. I'd like each one of your opinions. Which is more of an existential threat? Our debt that's progressed as far as you can see, that's a bird in the hand, that's absolute, to be at least $2 trillion a year. Out 10 years, sooner or later, we'll go through like a Chapter 11 to where that'll be reduced. What is more of a threat? Climate change or our national debt and the trajectory of it? Start over with Mr. McGinn.
Senator, I know Mike Mullen very well. We're friends, shipmates, work together very, very closely. And I have no doubt in his perspective that, in fact, national debt is a big national security and indeed nation challenge.
But which do you think is more of an existential threat?
It would be a mistake to focus only on that to the exclusion of other threats, like, for example, climate change, because climate change
And
and
I
Mother
agree with
Nature
you
aren't
there.
gonna-
I'm not saying that
they're
you-
not going to. It's not going to treat us more kindly in terms of our national debt and our needed investments to protect ourselves from increasing severe weather.
So I just like which one do you think is more of an existential threat?
It depends on the time frame. I think longer term, climate change left unattended or properly attended is a greater threat. In the near term, we have to deal with our national debt.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Here's what I know, is that if climate change continues unabated, that will increase our national debt over time. And when we're talking about adaptation and resilience investments, like the kinds that all members, I think, of the panel have referred to today, there are many studies showing that, spending $1 today gains
Are you willing to borrow
time.
more money to do it?
I think we need to make these investments
You'd
in
borrow and
resilience
spend
and
it
adaptation.
with the subjectivity associated with that over what we could do within our own discipline to get back to a healthy place where you could actually do something about it.
I think making our bases and installations more resilient, as we've talked about, to future threats, so we're not spending $10 billion like we're going to have to in Guam due to the wave that came through there, or what happened at Tyndall Air Force Base, which cost billions of dollars.
In the context of still borrowing $2 trillion a year, or do you think we ought to work on that first and then maybe pick the priorities?
I think we got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and deal with
Well, we haven't been
multiple
doing a very
threats.
good job at that. Next.
Sir, I'm a civil engineer by education and by trade, so I look at it from a infrastructure and what's the cost to protect the infrastructure we have. So it's, and bottom line, that's going to take investment. To your question, I don't know what's more of an existential threat, is the debt or climate change. All I know is that if we want to keep our military installations, which we project power from, we're going to have to invest to protect them.
Senator, I said in my opening statement that I acknowledge the challenges to national security imposed by climate change, but that the fact that 2024 will be the first time that the interest we pay on our debt is exceeding the Pentagon's budget, that I believe is a greater national security risk.
We know, and you know, sir, that peace begets prosperity, which is required for economic growth to sustain that same peace and stability. So I would say dealing with the debt is an immediate concern.
Thank you. And if I introduced a resolution today that climate was a threat to our national security, it'd barely get 50 votes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I might have an explanation for that, but I'll leave that for another day. Senator Warner.
So much to say and so little time. I agree with Senator Braun that national debt is a huge issue. We got close. My first gang was the Simpson Bowles gang. I worked very closely with Mike Mullen. Mike Mullen also thinks that climate change is a critical component. And I would point out to my colleagues, we're never going to get the debt under control unless you not only look at the spending side, but the revenue side. Of the 34 OECD nations in the world, America's 32nd. And if you go to those individuals, I'll take them all, take Jamie Dimon, take them all. They all agree, whether it's the infrastructure bill or the CHIPS bill, if we become economically non-competitive, we're never going to be able to grapple with the debt. I'm sorry, my friend from Wisconsin left, and when he started to attack people's science, I mean, long before I was governor or senator, I was on CNA, the FFRDC for the Navy. Early as the mid-90s, CNA, ahead of, frankly, most political figures, were saying, if we don't get ahead of climate change, it is a national security imperative. And I just wish, I'm not sure whether my friend Tim Kaine's already raised this, Rick, and it's great to see you again. The amount of money the Navy spends every year in Norfolk to raise the piers because of sea level rise. I would love to have some of my colleagues who just say, not really happening. I'd like to take them to a church in Norfolk that floods virtually every high tide. Never did before, but because of climate change. I'd like to take a look at the literally $500 million of federal funds that we have to put again into Norfolk. And again, Rick, thank you for your work on this. To make sure that we could raise sea level walls so we don't flood out one of the major cities in the Commonwealth of Virginia. For people to deny those facts is a complete disconnect from reality. And I would invite anyone of my colleagues to take a trip with me to Hampton Roads and see the effects firsthand of what it does to our economy, because if we don't have a strong economy, we're not going to be able to generate the revenues to bring down that debt. I think $34 trillion in national debt is a national embarrassment. I think we should have done Simpson Bowles a decade ago. And frankly, both political parties lost any credibility on this issue. Particularly my Republican friends after the Trump tax cuts, where the advocacy was borrowing is great. Well, borrowing is great until interest rates go back to any kind of rational basis, and we're seeing the effects of that right now. But to deny the absolute tangible cost, not in some future date, the cost this year is a complete divorce from reality. I am, and I was going to give you a great softball question about how the communities in Hampton Roads are going to work together better. But I'm down to 145, minute 45, and I don't get to the Budget Committee as much as I'd like, and the chairman will cut me off if I go on too long. So, Admiral Wiggin, one of the things you said in your testimony, I absolutely believe we need to make this conversion to a cleaner energy and deal with climate change. You have made clear in your testimony. I frankly believe, and I think you've raised this, respectfully to some of my other members, I don't think we can do it with solar and wind alone. I think we need a fresh look at small modular nukes, SMRs. I think the technology's advanced. They are carbon-free. We can do them from micro-size to the 150 to 300 megawatts, which, again, in many ways is not that much larger than what fuels our sailors on an aircraft carrier. And one of the things that I'm trying to work now with our friends on the Armed Services Committee is we need DOD to lean in on this issue. We're already going to see the energy needs that are created by the data centers that are going to power AI, the hyperscalers. They have to have some skin in the game. But your last 35 seconds, can you talk a little bit about how we can get DOD as an offtake provider, as I think SMRs and other technology can provide that clean energy, but we've got to generate the demand so we can get through that first-of-kind risk.
Senator, right on. I think that the outcome of having SMRs is absolutely necessary, has tremendous benefits, not just to reducing greenhouse gases, but importantly to our economic development and our technology. And I think that DOD does need to be a partner, and it has to be a public-private partnership. There are many utility companies, Dominion being one, Duke another, Southern Company, and the public utility company TVA very interested. So I think it has to be a public-private partnership with DOD, with DOE, to push forward SMR technology to not only get it developed fully, but to scale it and deploy it.
I'll take Chairman's prerogative here just to add that these emerging nuclear technologies create the opportunity to cleanly repower existing fossil heat plants where there's already turbines, there's already transformers, there's already a robust grid built, and there's already a technical workforce. All you have to do is boil the water with a different form of power to provide a really major improvement. So thank you for bringing that up, Senator Warner. Next, we have Senator Padilla, followed by Senator Lujan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate Senator Warner's example after example from Virginia on the topic at hand here. I'd like to raise a couple from my home state of California. Atmospheric rivers are high-impact winter storm events that provide 50% of annual precipitation in California and 80% of our flooding. These storms also hinder military aviation capabilities, which are kind of important on the Pacific, with increased turbulent airspace, visibility reduction, and surface wind impacts. Rear Admiral Gallaudet, you mentioned in your testimony that the Department of Defense needs to invest more in short-term, sub-seasonal, and seasonal forecast improvements. As you may be aware, I introduced a bill to that effect that was included in fiscal year 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, and it directs the Air Force and NOAA to prioritize weather reconnaissance flights over the Pacific Ocean for atmospheric river storm prediction. Given your roles as oceanographer of the Navy and acting administrator of NOAA, do you agree these Pacific reconnaissance flights are critical for understanding impacts on installations, training, and operations missions?
Absolutely, sir. I'd like to see more of those.
All right, but feel free to expand here for about 30 seconds.
Well, yes. In fact, when I was in charge of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we also supported those reconnaissance flights with our NOAA P3 hurricane hunters. When there's not a hurricane season around, they go to the West Coast and support the prediction and the observation efforts, which are critical to advance our environmental modeling. And the American Weather Model, which we started an effort to basically take the top spot from the Europeans. And so that work continues. It's called the Earth Prediction Innovation Center, and the atmospheric river prediction is a key component of it.
Thank you, thank you. The only thing I'll add to that is to be careful now utilizing the term season when it comes to these types of events. There used to be kind of a defined wildfire season in California until the wildfire started earlier and earlier and lasted longer and longer into the year. Now we're on our toes all year round. I think similarly for hurricanes and tornadoes for that matter. What used to be more of a defined season is expanding, and not a coincidence because our climate is indeed changing. Now, several of you have shared both in written testimony and in a conversation here today, you've referenced Guam. Guam suffered catastrophic flooding that requires significant funding now for repair and recovery. It's my understanding that the Naval Installations Command is currently supporting a research effort to enhance coastal resilience and better prepare for for the impacts from the changing climate on the most vulnerable installations across the Pacific. Question for Ms. Sikorsky. Academic researchers in California, how can academic researchers in California better support the Department of Defense's efforts to plan for and mitigate impacts at installations that face these threat multipliers?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator. I think the academic community, the scientific community, can be a huge resource for Department of Defense through the Minerva project and other opportunities there to marry that scientific research with the national security concerns to better understand the resilience needs. I think investments in that partnership are really important and can provide new information and new data that can make the Defense Department make better decisions.
Thank you. And a follow-up question to Vice Admiral McGinn. How else are Navy installations preparing for these threat multiplier events, and what are the tools are the agencies not currently utilizing but could or should?
I think across the board, Senator, especially in California, looking at the variance of threats could be rising water in San Diego, for example, or atmospheric rivers, or et cetera. Up at the Mountain Training Range for the Marine Corps, up in Bridgeport, it could be wildfires. They are trying to anticipate and to try to make themselves more resilient to these effects. Overall, I know you've very aware of power brownouts or blackouts that have happened in very, very hot weathers conditions, and usually in the late summer, early fall in California. The Navy has been trying to be a good partner with the California Energy Commission and the utilities out there, Southern California, Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, to make sure that the load is managed and reduced during those times so that we can keep the lights on for the greatest number of people.
Senator
Lujan.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Admiral Galina, if you wanted to.
I just wanted to add one more thing about resilience in the Marianas Islands and
Stop
our
the clock
installations
for
there.
Senator Lujan, so we're not using his time for
Okay.
Admiral Gallaudet's intervention. Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator, Chairman Whitehouse. One organization that I used to lead is the Naval Meteorology and Oceanography Command, and they're the command that predicts typhoons in the Western Pacific, and that's the most impactful event out there in terms of climatic. And so the improving those predictions and supporting that command with more investments, I think, will be very important going forward as we're going to operate more in the Indo-Pacific. And they're doing great work with the private sector. A California company called Sofar Ocean on Pier 28 in San Francisco makes ocean data buoys, and they have a global network, and that information is critical to improving our predictions of typhoons and really weather events worldwide.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
A fresh start.
thank you very much, Chairman Whitehouse, and good morning to you as well. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and to our panelists who are here as well. It's clear to me that the national security community needs more quality, up-to-date information to make decisions showing how climate change will affect military operations, infrastructure, and global security. The question is, who can we turn to in the United States for this practical scientific experience? Now, I'm proud to say that New Mexico is at the forefront of this effort. Every day, thousands of scientists and engineers at Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratory are hard at work at the most pressing national security issues, including those driven by climate change. And they've demonstrated time and again how their science delivers a safer and more prosperous nation. As climate change continues to grow as a threat to our security, we can rely on our labs to provide solutions to some of our hardest problems. Now, Ms. Sikorsky, I understand that you recently visited Sandia National Laboratory to learn about how the lab provides climate research and modeling to support our national security community. Is that correct? And what did you learn?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I learned obviously that the federal scientific community is a huge resource for combating the threats from climate change, and Sandia's deep experience on nuclear deterrence issues, right, and managing nuclear threats. That the lessons learned from that process can also help on the climate piece. I mean, the access they have to computing power and to data is just so huge, and they've got really smart people working these problems, and they're already partnering with the U.S. intelligence community and the Defense Department to move this forward. Congress has done some great work in this space too by setting up the Climate Security Advisory Council and the Climate Security Roundtable at the National Academies, and I would encourage Congress to continue pursuing innovative partnerships like that so labs like Sandia can be used to their maximum ability to tackle these security threats.
I appreciate that, Ms. Sikorsky. I've been very impressed with the capabilities of the supercomputers' ability to forecast climate disaster and solve so many challenges, not just that we face here around America and in America, but around the world. I recently introduced a bipartisan bill to improve our weather and climate models so we could be prepared before a disaster strikes. This was prompted because of the devastating wildfires that many of us have experienced around the West, and visiting with colleagues throughout the East Coast as well. The devastation that we've seen with erosion, rising oceans, it's something that I've found more commonality with than disagreement with. Mr. Sikorsky, yes or no, are the labs well positioned to answer key questions from the national security community considering their expertise and resources?
Yes, I think the labs are well positioned, and I would love to see even more efforts to bring lab personnel and national security experts together on a regular basis. Again, in my background in the intelligence community, I think having lab folks on rotation, you know, in those places regularly would really help.
Can you expand upon that with how these teams could be brought together more, how the labs could be utilized more in this effort?
Sure. I think what you see now a lot is, you know, the intelligence community has a question, they throw it over the fence to the labs do a big study, and then they throw it back, you know, 6 months, a year later. What I'd love to see instead is teams where they're doing co-production, right? Where you've got folks sitting around a table together, looking at the question from the very beginning and breaking down the silos, if you will, between the labs and the security community. And I know there's some innovation happening with some of the labs in that vein already, but it's kind of just testing it out. I'd love to see it expanded.
I appreciate that. I mean, the labs definitely have the security apparatus and clearances to be able to hold those kinds of robust conversations and problem-solving sessions. I appreciate that very much. The last thing that I'll share, Mr. Chairman, is when we're talking about some of the innovations made with small nuclear reactors from an energy perspective and things of that nature. I was concerned with the last, most recent Blue Ribbon Commission task force associated with spent fuel. It suggested just putting the spent fuel in the ground. I know it's expensive, but it's spent fuel. I think there's a reason why I'm referring to it as that. There's still useful life in this, but America's made a decision about not reprocessing, or dissimilar to other allies in the world like France. And I just think that if there's still a useful life in this stuff, rather than sticking it in the ground in a place like New Mexico where I don't want it, we need to be smarter about what reprocessing would look like at existing areas, locations, things of that nature across America. So, Mr. Chairman, that's where my head goes when I have this conversation, so that we include spent fuel as part of the solutions that, or one of the challenges that has to find a better solution as well. But very much appreciate this conversation. Thank you all for being here.
I thank the senator for that, and I look forward to continuing to work with him as we increase the capacity for developing next-gen nuclear reactors, which we've done several bills to improve, so that we can take that, some would say, nuclear waste, and repurpose it to positive value, repowering clean, safe nuclear projects. We've done considerable work together, and I'm grateful to the senator for raising that issue. I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing before the committee today. Your full written statements will be included in the record. Admiral Gallaudet, I want to thank you particularly for mentioning the China fisheries threat. And for anybody listening, Senator Sullivan of Alaska and I have a bill to address the international fisheries problem posed by China's very predatory fishing fleet and by the pirate fishing fleets that are out there essentially running slave ships outside the law and destroying the fish stocks of the world to the peril of our legitimate fishermen, something we care a lot about in Rhode Island. So to understand the national security component of that, I think, is very important, and I will publicly thank both the Navy and the Coast Guard for the way that they have much improved their working relationship in the fisheries enforcement area. A little more progress yet, but Secretary Del Toro in particular has been energized about working with the Coast Guard to make sure that we are meeting this challenge head on. The only other thing I'd say is that the oceans are measurably warming at a massive scale. It's measured in zettajoules, which is 21 zeros. It's a really enormous number. And surface temperatures are measurably increasing. And we know that warmer ocean surface temperatures power up hurricanes and cyclones. So when you question attribution science between ocean measurements and cyclones, I would urge you to be careful. You adjusted your testimony to say that as to any one given cyclone, but I would suggest to you that that's not the point. It's impossible to attribute any one given home run to a baseball player who is jacked on steroids. But when you look at the numbers of home runs and the power of the hits, you can't then use that problem of attribution to deny the underlying fact that steroids are warping the performance of the baseball player. So I would be careful about making that point as you pursue your repertoire. And questions for the record are due by 12 o'clock noon tomorrow. I ask the witnesses to respond to any questions that we get by 12 noon tomorrow within 7 days of receipt. And with no further business before the committee, I will adjourn the hearing.